This is our final session together. It's entitled Lessons Learned and Potential Paths Forward. And as I was sitting listening to these very interesting sessions before, I was asking those same questions, but in a broader frame of time, thinking about how even within my lifetime, these issues have evolved so tremendously fast and with such overwhelming and baffling challenges. What the philosopher Hans Jonas has called the progressive scale of freedom in peril. I was thinking about how not so long ago really, in 1949, Linus Pauling published his seminal paper describing the first, identifying the first molecular basis of a genetic disease. And that called to mind the fact that a little more than 20 years later, when there was a growing body of understanding of genetics and growing concern about it, he was himself, Linus Pauling, was advocating that people who were carriers of genetic disease, namely heterozygotes where the disease is recessive, that these people be conspicuously marked so that they would be identifiable to one another. In other words, what he suggested was that there be a tattoo placed on the body so that when somebody was starting to get interested in somebody else as a potential partner, that they would, as he said, recognize this situation and refrain from falling in love. So for years in my classes at Stanford, we debated where, he suggested a small tattoo. And so for years we debated in my classes just where on the body that tattoo ought to be located in the courtship process. He actually went on to say, advocate such legislation in this manner. He said, "It is my opinion that legislation along this line, compulsive testing for defective genes before marriage, and some form of public or semi-public display of this possession should be adopted." And that made me think how we've advanced scientifically, but we also, I believe, are making some advances in our capacity to talk about these matters publicly and to think sensitively about the personal and social issues associated with them. These debates, and just today is a really good example, they're about a lot more than just policy formation. In the end, these issues are about our collective social and our individual personal lives and the choices that we make. And it's so important that the way we discuss these issues, the way we talk about them, and those of us who are helping bring in the public debate, it's so important that we talk about these matters in ways that are sensitive to the very subject we're addressing, namely our collective and personal lives. The way we even word these discussions or frame them conceptually and procedurally will affect the character of our culture, but also many individual lives and the way people feel about themselves. So this session is a kind of a wrap-up session where we're going to take the great wealth of experience and insights that have been on display today, and we're going to hear from each of our panelists briefly, talk a little bit between ourselves, as we've done before, and then open it up to questions. Our goal here in the session is to distill out, fill in gaps, and try to identify a coherent way to integrate these insights and a plan to move forward collectively to address these issues on a national and international level.
First of all, we were asked to just prepare a few minutes that was, in a sense, independent of just hearing everything everybody said today, but then to have a discussion with you all where we be responsive, because my head is just full of all the important things people said today. But I'm going to just say a few summary things first. And after years of always using just written notes, I'm trying to do it off my phone like a modern person. So let me just get this on. Okay. So we heard several times, and especially in the last panel, people say what kind of public or public engagement we need, or publics, depends on what is our purpose in the first place. So what is the reason that we're all, is there a common reason, and probably not, that all of us in this room are so concerned with public engagement? What is public engagement for? And I just want to make a list. I already have in my head a kind of hierarchy here that I think has moral importance. But I'm starting from, well, first of all, let's just put on one side of it, which we heard some really great examples of in the last panel. There's educating the public, science education. So I'm going to put that on the side for a minute. I think science education is incredibly important. And it's true that really good education is not one way. And there's lots to say about that. And there's a lot of science educators in this room. But I'm not going to put that on my moral hierarchy list for now. I'm going to put that on one side as done well, an uncontested public good. Let's just put it that way, that a more educated public is good. So now the other side, besides education, is influence. Basically trying to influence the public. As I say to my public health ethics graduate students, everything we do in public health is trying to mess with other people. And that means ethics is important right from the beginning, especially people's rights. So in a certain sense, public engagement, other than for education, is in some way we're trying to mess with people. I just want you all to acknowledge that, because that's a moral problem and challenge right there. So here's my hierarchy going from, I don't know, I'm going to offend probably everybody here by the time I'm done, but going from what's most problematic to hopefully I'm going to defend most strongly. So it's very biased. But at the most concerning level for me is PR. You know, we're here because people want gene editing to get out there. There's scientists and industry and publics and people and patient disease groups and everybody who want to make sure this stuff happens. So very much a PR thing. I don't think people all came today because of PR, but that's something we always have to look at. I'm very involved. I speak at Davos and around the world. I'm very involved in situations where I always have to think, is this PR? So that's the minimalist and most problematic. But I'm going to put next to that, and I will offend at least some people here, extracting public data. When we talked about the films that are being used where there's an analysis of the films, how many times people click on it, where's our person who makes the films? I wanted to ask, do you get informed consent for the people using your website? Do they know you're measuring their clicks?
That's a good question.
It's a good question.
We haven't hit the start with that. This is not in public.
It's not public yet. But from my other hat is AI ethics and manipulation of the public and all that. When we extracting gene information, which is a big topic today, is like this big of a societal deal this is totally biased. Extracting every single thing about everybody here is like the business of business right now. So when we want to know what people think, they have a right to know that we're using their information. So it can help people do their work better to know what the public thinks. But we need to. I'm not asking about your films because everybody's involved that knows they're involved. So they've chosen to engage. So to me, there's no problem with that. That's my giving lots of opinions. But the point is, the second level of problematic and contested is if we're extracting public data to know what the public thinks. The third level is if we're trying to have an interaction with the public that will ultimately help them experience buy-in. The fourth level, I'm going in my higher in the maybe more ethically supportive of the public, would be representation. We want people there so that we feel like we've represented the public. I see a lot of that today in all of our remarks. And there's nothing wrong with representation. It's a really good thing. I don't think it's the highest thing, but I think it's a good thing. But then comes the next level. I'm looking at Katie. I think she was talking about what I would say public interest. And that's why groups that have long-standing representation of public interests, unmet public interests. So that can happen around race, that can happen around disability, but it's the people that we know are often indigenous rights. It's people who may not otherwise be represented. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm going to go one step higher, but it encompasses all these people. The word public means something. It has moral meaning in these contexts. It means it's not just the interest of commercial or industry. It's not just the interest of the politically powerful. That's what public means. in these settings, it's got a particular substantive moral meaning. It means there's something in people's lives that is not going to be captured by the empowered corporate or political interests that might otherwise control their lives. So when we talk about the public in that way, we're really, and by the way, I wrote all this today. This is all, it is actually a reflection of whatever you were all saying when listening to every single talk. So now's the part that I didn't write today, but I wrote with a group of people here. I think that so everything I'm saying up till now is for all, up for debate anyway, but now I'm going to say a particular point of view some of us here have developed recently. And it's an article that came out in the CRISPR journal recently. And I'm involved, Sharon O'Hara, Lee and Kevin, who you've met today, and Lex Owen. We all worked on this project together. But we were thinking about how do you really speak to this need of each person in the public who might be vulnerable because corporate or political or other interests might not protect them. And the way we came to the idea that that's a human rights interest, and that to really represent that, which several people today brought up human rights, it's not enough to have public engagement. There has to be a real way of looking at human rights impacts. And we talked about a human rights impact assessment. And I just want to really quickly give you, because I'm a philosopher, I have to give you an argument for why we need that. So real quick, public engagement historically can involve the majoritarian, I think Alta still here said majoritarianism, but tyranny of the masses. So we saw in Oregon in 1989, the state of Oregon rationed care for Medicaid, and they had all kinds of public engagement. Bob Kaplan, who's the guy who invented, I worked with him, he invented QALYs. They did very high level public engagement. But they were sued under the Americans with Disability Act because it turns out, and a lot of people know this, that non-affected publics have very different opinion of life with disability than affected publics. So who decides? Everybody was there. Disabled people were represented, but they're not majority. So there were issues of representation, but there's also majoritarianism. So no amount of engagement would have solved that problem. I think. I mean, I'd love to hear an idea where it would. But even now, we were talking today about, even among different groups with disabilities, if you've got a disability, someone said it beautifully earlier, if it's your identity, if you have a lifelong disability and you're in like deafness and you're in a disability rights context, you'll have one view of gene editing for deafness. If you have an acquired deafness, you'll have another view. So even within, anyway, you guys get what I'm talking about. So it turns out that public engagement can't solve the problem of oppression of underserved minorities like people with certain disabilities. So that's why we need human rights in that context. It also turns out that I'll critique my own profession of philosophy and principlism, because principlism can't solve it either. And even the best, and this is a challenge, Ben, for you and for Sheila, for the Global Observatory, which really interests me and I think is fantastic in many ways. But when we talk about the human, I know both of you have criticized philosophy a lot and principlism, but there's a risk of, you have to explain to me, we talked about this, how that's not being reinvented, or Sheila will talk about it, because you don't want to have an essentialist discussion of the human, right? So how do you wind up with concepts that are valuable? What we know historically, and I live by concepts and I want that to happen, but concepts historically have not actually helped come up with a genuinely representative approach to a problem, because of the problem that people do much better with cases and looking at real contextual cases. So we saw that with the US President's Commission on Bioethics, and looking at brain death and looking at the Karen Quinlan case. And when is it okay to disconnect someone from a respirator? And how when you made that decision, we had people from religious groups and ethics groups and sociological and cultural groups come together. But when they did it over a case, people could really come up with deep insights that were protective of the humans involved. But when they then talked about their orientations in terms of their conception of the human, or in my profession, autonomy or whatever else, they radically disagreed and could not come up with anything productive. So that's my challenge for the panel. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Julie and Ben and Bill and the other organizers for inviting all of us to an extremely rich and rewarding day. So at one level, especially shortly before 5 o'clock and being on East Coast time, I'm tempted to just declare a victory and walk off, because I think we've had a wonderful smorgasbord of ideas. And if one wanted to say, is there an issue that's generating responses from scientists, civil society, people in the arts and the humanities, as well as in policy and so forth. I've been in and around science policy for a very long time. I don't think I've seen any other issue mobilize as great a variety of responses as this one has. So in that sense, why don't we all just go home? So that would not be the challenge of this last panel and where to look going forward. And I think that one should do a little bit of unpacking of the hidden assumptions behind all that togetherness and all that positivity without denigrating the positivity, okay? I mean, that is a big caveat, and I hope you'll keep it in mind. So possibly because of my hidden training in linguistics, I am not a very big fan of the person of color appellation, because it carries with it a sense of what is marked and what is not marked. And yet I look around this room and see that if you want to talk about the conventional meaning of person of color, there aren't too many people of that sort here. So that immediately leads us to thinking harder about this changes everything, to borrow Naomi Klein's title on climate, kind of rhetoric underlying what we're doing today. There is a sense that we're all here because this is the most important project. A couple of people have actually said that this is one of the most important projects, if not the most important, that's confronting humanity. So let's take that proposition seriously. Supposing this is a question that is confronting humanity in a way that is similar to the climate catastrophe or whatever, then at what level is that true? Not because we're getting a new set of tools to deal with rare inherited genetic disorders. We already have some tools for dealing with those anyway. We will find others. Maybe it's gene editing, but that is not the reason why people in this room are convinced that there is a specter in the, before civilization that is causing us to sit back and say, we all must get involved in this debate. So I think that it's because people sense that in some sense, the whole meaning of humanness is the thing that is at stake. To what extent are we designers and engineers of ourselves and our own futures? That is more like the thing that's at stake. So if those are the stakes, then how well are we doing? And I want to talk quickly about 3 Ds in which I think we're not doing so well conceptually, Jody, to pick up on your little challenge, which obviously I can't do justice to in the 5 to 7 minutes that we've been allotted. So the first D is diversity, which I've already alluded to, the question about which publics, but I think we get a little over-enthusiastic when we say things like citizens of the world. If you take citizens seriously, the world is not electing the climate president who is able to take the kinds of actions that we might be wanting to take for the good of the world, right? We're very much divided into nation states and their archaic rules, whereby in several countries I know, including the more civilized one to the north of us, minority votes elect the leader of the government. So, in that sense, what is a citizen of the world today? I mean, maybe we should not be using that kind of terminology without thinking all of the things that somehow accrue to the word citizen, and asking very serious questions, not just about representation, but about voice. I mean, where are the places where these so-called citizens of the world can have voice? And have we created those? And I think while there are initiatives that are exceedingly admirable, most of them remain within the parochial constraints of their own philosophical and political systems, in which they achieve a degree of robustness. Again, I don't want to downplay that, but the overarching conversations, I don't think are being had. The second D is the driver's seat. Who is in the driver's seat? And I think that from my standpoint as a builder of the field of science and technology and society, or science and technology studies, it is still too often the science. The science leads and the analyst follows. And I frankly have never liked the role of camp follower. So, there are traits that go with that, and I reject them. So if we were not all standing around talking about human genome editing and were instead talking about what I think is the bigger issue, what is the perfectibility of the human, and who should be deciding that today, and by what means, and to what extent are the techniques themselves wrapped up in this larger set of questions about human perfectibility, well, I do slog through the newspapers, and what are we reading about? We're reading about the Fresno shooting. We're reading about the Essex lorry. We're reading about the anniversary of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And then we're talking about human genome editing. Well, at least the bridge between those conversations about damaged human societies and their propensities to doing things that, equipping everyone with blue eyes will somehow not cure for the world. That conversation needs to be had. And I think that the sedulous absence of the economic discussion today has been troubling to me, because the question of who is in the driver's seat really is wrapped up with those things that were mentioned very en passant in the last panel. Intellectual property, I think Julie mentioned this, but all of those questions about corporate tie-ins, and, it's next year will be the 40th anniversary of the Bayh-Dole Act, which brought about a changed relationship in America between universities and industry, and that all, I think, needs to be taken account of. So there's an intersectionality of issues and interests, which I don't think we've quite done justice to, though I will say that the Center for Genetics and Society, with the idea that Bill McKibben was being brought onto the same page as gene editing, is a step in that direction. But nevertheless, it remains within the ambit of a very American set of debates, which cannot be generalized. And then, the question of the debate. I mean, what is the singular debate that we're really talking about? And I think that the debate needs to be pluralized, because gene editing is tied up with a set of other debates about poverty, inequality, name it. The fact that people sitting in Silicon Valley are declaring that we need to pour billions into aging research, this skews the set of things that we're driving the research toward, and the entire framing of the research needs to be looked at. So the observatory, as we've talked about it, Jody and others, and, there's obviously not time to talk about it in detail, is meant only as a partial answer to the parochialisms of the current forums. And I guess And there are three kinds of parochialisms that we've talked about. One at the professional level, that the people who are designated ethicists need to talk to other people. One is the international one, which is very important because there's robust discussion, but with the exception of a few people like Laurence, they're not really talking about debates that reach across very well-developed systems of debate and deliberation and framings of issues. And a third one is the intersectoral one, which also includes something that is bridged in this panel between the secular and the religious, and between other forms of knowing and looking. So the observatory seeks to bridge some of those parochialisms that I've mentioned about the driver's seat, about the nature of the debate, and about the framing of the diversity. And I guess lastly, since you threw this at me about concepts, so if philosophers are not the only people with concepts, I know I don't need to tell you, but like political theory also has concepts, and even science studies has generated some concepts, even though we started with cases. If one takes the idea of co-production very, very seriously, if one notes the different ways and different degrees and depths at which we produce accounts of the world, representations of the world that cohere with and bolster our sense of those things that we normatively should do in the world, then the project of critique becomes completely different. I mean, then you cannot have anyone who is inside this epistemic normative order being a critic of the very order in which she, or should I say they, are embedded, at a given time. So I guess I would propose that one of the reasons why we want a deeper interdisciplinary debate is that even the conceptual structures in which we've learned to think, which may not be the ones with which we go out and communicate with the public, nevertheless, that there's a sorting out to do there that is non-trivial, and that I hope is one of the things that comes out of this meeting and this discussion. So thank you.
So first, I'd just like to say how incredibly grateful I am to be here and to be part of this session. And I congratulate the team massively in pulling all of this together. It's amazing. So you might see from my bio that I'm actually a law academic. I think perhaps I'm one of the few here. And I come all the way from Tasmania. Tasmania is the little heart-shaped island at the bottom right-hand corner of Australia. My interest is in the ethical and social implications of gene and other related technologies and how these can be reflected in our legal and regulatory environment around these technologies. So my reflections now are based on my own interests, but also on the key messages that I picked up from the discussion today. So it's clear there are boundless possibilities for gene editing technology and significant ethical and social implications. And they vary depending on the nature of the technology. I just have to mention that prior to this, I spent the last 2 days in Colorado debating these issues in the context of agriculture, with particular focus on IP. And I do have to mention that Julie also coordinated that meeting as well. I don't know how you do both. And there she was faced with a massive snowstorm, which added to the challenges. So you've done amazingly well. So we've seen that gene editing is also going to be incredibly relevant in the treatment of disease in adults and children, eradication of infectious diseases like malaria, and of course the therapies that can be passed on to future generations. Each of these applications carries its own risks and ethical and social implications. And people have very different views on gene editing depending on the type of application. And I'm going to make a few sweeping generalizations here based on the public engagement research that I've done and things that I've picked up today. First of all, in general, I would say that people have far greater concern about what we eat than what medications we take and what we have done to our bodies. GM food is a far more concern in the public consciousness than gene therapy. Secondly, attitudes vary dependent on social, cultural, and political environments. This probably goes without saying, but it's been particularly highlighted, I think, today. However, there are commonalities. For instance, research shows that people tend to make very clear distinctions between therapies and enhancements. And that goes to what was said, excuse me, I've just lost my spot, which is why I shouldn't scroll as I'm going. Yeah, so as Mohammed noticed, in relation to the Islamic world, I think those things still apply more broadly. And thirdly, research also shows the critical importance of public trust in this area. There's been a big multinational study on people's attitudes towards use of their DNA. This has just been completed and findings are just coming out. It's called Your DNA, Your Say, which some of you might be familiar with. So I was involved in the Australian component of the study, and it really illustrates this critical importance of public trust across the board. But differences do arise depending on demographics in different countries. For example, one of the things that was clear that young men from the US tend to have greater levels of trust than other people, which I think is quite interesting. So what I'm seeing in my research and in other discussions today is that people are willing and able to engage in very nuanced deliberations. And they should be given the opportunity to do so. It's emerging in these studies that are a range of values underpinning people's attitudes towards genetic technologies. So I'll just name 3 of them. Altruism, the idea of contributing to the greater good. Reciprocity, if you take something, that you should also give something back. And solidarity, we're all in this together. Equitable access and benefit sharing are also critically important to people. And these values also underlie their attitudes towards trust in individuals and organizations that are involved. People trust academic researchers and universities, much more so than companies, because they see they better reflect these values. So it's really important for us to understand how these values play out in the context of gene editing in all of its forms, I think. We need to understand differences in views globally, and that's why I think the discussion today is so important. And that's why I'm involved in Sonia's proposal for a citizen jury, a global citizen jury. I think it's really important to have these discussions globally. We haven't had anywhere near enough public deliberation in the gene editing context as a whole, and particularly in the context of germline editing. In my view, and from my experience, inviting people to deliberate for themselves is more powerful than asking them to provide input into expert committees. The experts should be going out to them, not the other way around. Public dialogue and deliberation is really hard to do well, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And this public conversation needs to be ongoing. We can't just tick it off as having been done. We have to keep doing it. In the meantime, I just have to come back to the legal context because I'm a lawyer. Many of the countries around the world who are active in this area do have some form of regulation in place to guard against the creation of more so-called CRISPR babies. For example, China has actually significantly tightened its oversight in recent times, but the type of regulation varies greatly. So in my country, for example, it's a criminal offence to manipulate the human germline with a maximum penalty of up to 15 years imprisonment, which shows how seriously these things are taken there. In others, it's more in the form of research guidelines. This is relevant because some forms of regulation are going to be much more difficult to change than others, and there are pros and cons associated with this. I think we probably all agree that now is not the time to be thinking about changing these regulations. But when, if ever, will it be? I don't think we're in a position to move forward on this question yet. It's a matter for deep reflection by scientific experts, ethicists, lawyers, politicians, but also society as a whole. I don't think we can expect to have broad societal consensus, but we might find positions that we can all live with. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizers, to my fellow panelists, to the presenters, to the audience for this opportunity to be here today. I had prepared the usual PowerPoint presentation that I pull from my 96 slide deck. But I decided earlier while I was on the plane, because I came a little bit late today, but also listening to the other panels that I was able to hear today, that I would ditch that and that I would actually speak in a way that I don't speak very often. And that is to talk quite directly about what I'm doing here in two ways, what I'm doing here and what I'm doing here. So I'm going to veil that or frame it with some of my background vocabulary. I am an English professor. I have been doing this for a long time. I work at Emory University. I have been involved in developing the field of what we now call critical disability studies, which we understand as an interdisciplinary field. And the contribution that I have made, as well as the contribution that many of my closest colleagues have made, is to bring the assumptions and the methods, the practices, and the data, if you will, of the humanities, particularly the humanities enterprises that think about the cultural work of meaning making and the cultural work of language and representation, into considerations about what we think of as the human variations we consider to be disabilities. So that's what I've been doing for a long time. I decided 5 or 6 years ago to become a bioethicist, and that's what I'm doing here. And I decided to do that because I wanted to learn more about, talk about, perhaps even get to the bottom of eugenics. Eugenics as, of course, an historical era. Eugenics as a set of practices. And eugenics as a way of thinking that is part of the development of what we sometimes call late modernity. In thinking about eugenics, I realized that I needed to shift my audience, that working in the humanities as I had been with colleagues, thinking about the cultural meanings and cultural representations of disability, I was to a certain extent preaching to the choir, and that I needed to shift my audience in some way to an audience of people engaged with the practices that I was considering to be eugenics, and the practices and the policy making and the technology development that concerned people with disabilities most fully in this particular moment and this particular place. So in saying what I'm doing here, I need to acknowledge, as we do, my own positionality as a researcher. I need to establish standpoint theory. Everything I know I learned from feminist theory and critical race theory, so I always position myself in that way. But so I'm an educator. I guess I'm a researcher. I certainly am a writer. I guess I'm an advocate. But it occurred to me that I'm also, and I really like this, a community organizer. Now, I remember when Barack Obama was running for president, he had been a community organizer, and sort of secretly I thought, I wonder what that is. But it sounded really good, and it was impressive, and I have some sort of an idea. But by saying I'm a community organizer, I want to say that that's the kind of bioethicist that I am going to be. And the community that I am organizing is a community of disability bioethicists. In other words, I want to work with colleagues, any of you, any colleagues that want to work on this enterprise, to develop a field, an area of specialization, a network, a community of disability bioethicists. That is, people who have the authority to speak about and perhaps for people with disabilities and the topic of disability in relation to bioethics. And I'm going about that, what I'm doing here, by inviting myself to every party I'm going to go to, which is exactly what I do, and to gather people together to work within the frameworks, the institutions, the structures, the assumptions, the disciplines, however we want to talk about it, that I have access to build this community of disability bioethicists. And to be a disability bioethicist, one needs to have knowledge of and experience in disability culture and disability communities. So that means that many of the people in the community I and many of my colleagues are trying to organize will be people with disabilities, but they will also be people that make disability culture, live in disability culture, know disability communities, live in disability communities. So I would invite all of us to be recruiters with me for this enterprise. Somebody's going to have to stop me, by the way, because when I don't have slides to click through. 2 minutes? Okay. What happened to me when I became a bioethicist, and I did this by training as a bioethicist. I'm getting a master's degree in bioethics as soon as I finish my thesis, which is delayed. I'm publishing in bioethics journals. I'm attending bioethics conferences and meetings. So I'm participating in the structures of bioethics in order to become a bioethicist. To my amazement, when I became a bioethicist and entered into these communities and into these conversations, I also became a patient. And I had never really understood myself as a patient before. I had always understood myself as a person with a disability, but not as a patient, which did not mean that I had not had my body and life medicalized in some way or received or been involved in medical treatment. But I do not and did not understand myself primarily as a patient, and I was quite taken aback by this. I got all sorts of unsolicited diagnoses when I entered into these spaces to do a practicum in a genetics clinic. It was arresting and interesting. And I began to understand that to be a patient and a bioethicist at the same time was a very useful position to be in. And so I would recruit people who participate in the category of people with disabilities, disability culture makers, disability community engagement advocates. There are lots of other words, but who also are people identified as patients. So is my time up?
Okay. You can say one more thing.
One more. My family calls me the queen of one more thing. I would say that the people that I work with that I would consider to be fellow disability bioethicists do not in any way agree about questions such as what conditions we ought to identify in our developing of tools for genetic editing, or a variety of other kinds of practical questions and policies around what might be called disability bioethics. But I think we all would agree on one thing, and this is what I want to mention, and that is that we need, all of us, everyone involved in these enterprises, to think about redistributing resources. I would like to see, for example, a mere $50,000 taken out of NSF grants or NIH grants and put toward, for example, an organization. It's a pop-up posse called the Blind Posse that operates here in San Francisco, that is composed of blind people that go around to museums and help museums establish better access for blind and partially sighted people. They're kind of like guerrilla girls with white canes. I would like to see a mere $50,000 contributed to my colleague Josh Mila's project called You Describe. Josh is a blind computer scientist who works now for Amazon and is developing You Describe as a crowd-sourced audio description enterprise for people describing YouTube videos so that they can become accessible to blind people. So there are all sorts of projects that are coming out of disability culture that need support in order to make lives better for people with disabilities, in order to create environments that are supportive, that will sustain people with disabilities living as we are. And I want to see subjugated knowledge of people with disabilities brought forward into these conversations. So that's why I'm here.
When I told my fellow priests that I'm coming to Berkeley, they're saying that I'm going to the lion's den. They said, like, you got invited to Berkeley. It's like yeah, I didn't know that is a problem, but apparently it's supposed to be very secular. And that they were surprised that I would be invited to speak here. So, well, I didn't care. I mean, we're close to San Francisco, which is named after a saint, so shouldn't be a problem. I'll be brief, because I was told that when you preach a homily, the sermon should not last more than 8 minutes. Okay, that's the 5. Okay, I'll be briefer then. So just a few reflections. I think I would like to mention about the how religious communities could engage more as one of these partners in conversation, or I don't like the word consensus, but I guess conversation is a good word in these debates. I think, first of all, religious traditions is important, and many, I mean, not just Catholicism, but many groups in the world or people in the world belong to some kind of religious tradition. And I think it would be a shame if religion is not a part of this conversation. I think in some way there is a little bit of marginalization of religious voices, in part because it's, I guess, it's considered a little bit of sectarian, that it can cause division because there are so many different religious ideals and positions, and that you can never arrive at a consensus. Maybe that's not what we want, a consensus. And so I think this is an important element that we need to consider. The other thing that is that religions also has not done a good job. I mean, I have to admit, when I was talking to other priests about CRISPR, they said, CRISPR, potato chips? I mean, this is like, they have no idea. So it's not, I mean, I'm talking about philosophers and things like that. They have never heard of CRISPR. So in some way, I think we have a job within the religious community, the experts, to kind of come to terms, to engage science in a more meaningful way. And then I think different religions have different, at different levels. In some Christianity and Judaism, and maybe to a certain extent Islam, has done more in this field with engaging science than, let's say, the Eastern religions. I'm aware of that. And then there's also the question of engaging its members. I think that's one way of also where these values and principles can be transmitted to its own members. I guess that's one thing. And then how do you engage the outside world? I mean, those are the 3 levels. I think it's still a lot of work to be done. I think it is also part of our responsibility to do that. And I don't know. I don't have the answer how to do this, but I think in terms of CRISPR and things like this, it's still a lot of work to be done. The other thing I think that one part of the this kind of engagement is that we have to come from I think religious positions tend to be very strong, right? And we should be unabashed, in a sense, not be afraid to speak about where we're coming from. I think that's one problem, I think, in these kind of dialogues is that people are afraid to speak out and say like, what you really believe, right? They're trying to say, oh, we're all the same. We all believe that goodness and very general things, and then not want to go down to the specifics because the specifics could be divisive kind of thing. So I think that's also another point that we need to be able to speak out as religions, to say this is really what we believe, and don't be too apologetic about it, because if you're too apologetic, you really just water down your message. So I think that's one of the things that I think from a Catholic perspective, I would say that the question about the human embryo is important for us, that in some way the question of genetic engineering or gene editing, it's not the first question. The first question is actually in vitro fertilization, IVF, which the church disapproves because in some way it deforms the whole sense of the human sexual act, and then creation of embryos that would be manipulated and eventually be selected for or against. And so it's in some way kind of eugenics, just like the previous speaker was talking about. It's already you're trying to perfect the embryo. And so what we see today now with gene editing is actually, for me, is a logical progression after what we started 30 years ago with the first IVF baby. So this is actually something that is, for me, is very to be expected. It's not something that you should be surprised. So this is a logical progression, and it's inevitable in some way. And so another, I think, point that I think religion can contribute to this conversation is the fact that religions have come along with a lot of stories. We talked about stories just now. And from these human stories, either from biblical or from Quran or from the East, these stories are actually stories of wisdom. It tells you about the values, about the tragedies, about the successes of the human endeavors. And I think these are things that could be learned, that we can learn. I mean, here we talked about the question of pride and hubris, and about identity, about the human identity, who we are, and where we want to go. These are questions that religion has traditionally been good at, telling these stories. And they may not be a hard scientific facts that we want, but these are especially, I think, valuable, because if we can glean from these values, they could help us make the right prudential judgment and decisions. And so another question is basically about what it means to be human, what it means to be in control, the meaning of human perfection, and both in the East and the West, the question of transcendence or spirituality or immortality. I mean, in some way, a lot of these things that we want these are human aspirations to be better, to be more perfect, to transcend in some way, no? And so these are questions that religion has also looked at for a long time. And so I think there is a place for religion in this conversation. And we should not be afraid of different voices or even uncomfortable voices. I think these are good things, because I think if you can confront with different ideas, different ideals, and even things that you disagree with, it actually helps you to see why you think in a different way. It's actually positive, because if you just invite people to agree with you, like preaching to the choir, then basically there is no longer that like real engagement. It's kind of superficial. So I think this is the challenge, and this is something that we should appreciate in some way, the contribution of religion in this regard. I think I kept it to 5 minutes. Oh,
That's good. Thank you.
8.
So we have only about 10 minutes left, and what I would suggest we do is we go down the line, and each of you make any further comment on something that's been said, or highlight something special from today's discussions, or one last thing you think needs to be said that's been missing. So do you feel like you could start that, Jody?
I think I want to defer most of my time to the audience. I thought this panel was amazing, and I know if Joe is still here talking about Indigenous people and ownership of their genetic material, he has an actual model of doing that. That's pretty amazing. So I defer my minute to him when we turn to the audience.
You only have 1 minute each anyway. You're up.
I've been told that I'm a pessimist. I think one unspoken thing is that, I'm not sure if this is true, the holy grail for the scientists is actually, in some way, enhancement of the embryos. They really want that. All the other things they're talking about, treatment, whatever, is kind of like a means to achieve this end. I think this is what scientists really want to offer, is that we will give you the baby, just like the Russian scientist is doing. It's like, this is the unspoken, we all said we don't want this, but ultimately, is this really what we want? And that's a question that I really want to challenge the scientists.
I'm happy to give up practically all of my minute, but I think that the going back to the edit verb suggests that you know what the right text is and you're editing to make it correct. And I think that we've heard a lot today about how there isn't a single right text. So against what background text are we doing the editing? That's one of the things I'll take away.
I too won't say very much, but I'm glad you reminded me about Joe. So there have been many profound statements today, but I think his was the most profound, and it really emphasized how much everybody in the world is contributing to this, and we shouldn't forget that.
I wanted to say another thing about what I was calling subjugated knowledge, which is another way of saying counterintuitive knowledge. And someone on the earlier panel mentioned the perhaps perplexing response that a man, I wasn't here this morning, a man with sickle cell was ambivalent about whether he wanted sickle cell to continue in his family or something like this. I think that this is an important contribution that disability bioethics can make. Not that we, whatever we might mean, would all have the same kind of knowledge, but one of the things that is quite counterintuitive to people in the abled minority, or let's say, the abled minority, or the majority, would be the idea that many of us hold that there is great advantage in having a congenital or early acquired disability. Because, this is the logic, that since disability is inherent, the human variations that we think of as disabilities are inherent in human enfleshment, everyone will experience disability sometime in their lifetimes. So disabilities such as blindness and deafness, which are common late onset disabilities, it is very good for us to have an advanced guard, people who are expert patients, if you will, or expert deaf people, expert blind people, to develop the technologies to be the resource gatherers of these experiences early on in life. Many of us actually feel that it's an advantage to become disabled or to be born with our disabilities. That's a profoundly counterintuitive premise. Now, not all of us feel that way, but it's a profoundly counterintuitive premise within the enterprise of science and medicine. So that's just one example.
That's a very thoughtful comment. It's been pointed out, and this is for Father Tim, that every human being ends up ultimately in this phase of disability at some point, and that the priest, or at least the monk, takes on the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which we sooner or later all of us are going to have to enter into as we give up the earth. But I want to just add to what you said about enhancement, because it's not just enhancement of performance capacities. At the founding of the Center for Regenerative Medicine, William Hazeltine, who is himself quite a respected scientist, said, and this is a quote, "The real goal is to keep people alive forever." That's a little different from the kind of forever you have in mind. But I think we should allow some audience comments before we end here for a few minutes. Do we really have to finish at that hour? Can we just take 10 more minutes? Yeah, why not? We're all here. Michael.
I thought what we were talking about was amazing, and I also think it ties everything together. And
For the online folks.
sorry about that. And you were talking about your work studying eugenics, and I think it's one of the great untold stories of the last century was the American Eugenics Society. And what's interesting is they tried to build a consensus. They gathered a group of elites and faith leaders. They were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations, and they were asked to come up with a strategy for how do we get more from the fit and less from the unfit. And, everyone has heard of the Oliver Wendell Holmes decision, three generations of imbeciles is enough, and he forced a woman to be sterilized. Father, the sole dissenting vote was from a Catholic on that one. And I just want to encourage you in that work, and also Arizona State to really bring it together is doing a lot of pioneering work there in terms of talking about the history of the Eugenics Society in America.
So we could also let the questions moderator. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, so I think we've seen there that there's quite a rift between those who are more on the bioethics side and those who are more on the biopolitics side. And so if I talk into the more biopolitics side, my question, well, first to the first two speakers would be, if you take a decision, if you get the principle, if you get an idea of the policy that you want to enforce, how do you enforce that policy? If you like CRISPR and the substances that make the editing possible are like a drug, and when you declare a war on drug, well, the drugs usually win. So my question would be, if you are in this idea that, as some say, this is a power on human life and you need to decide how you manage this power, what kind of institutional design do you see able to actually enforce any decision that we would take on what is right, what is wrong, and what can any state or company or agent or entity do about it?
I don't know. I'm not going to speak to institutional design. It's super important, just not my specialty.
One might take issue with your statement that whenever you declare a war on drugs, the drugs win. And it may be because by the time we declare the war on the drugs, they already have won. And one might then wonder, how is it that we come to recognize that there is a drug that we should be waging a war on, which is itself a very complicated question, and different societies have approached that in different ways. But I think you also pose a very interesting point when you contrast bioethics and biopolitics, because I don't think the two of them can be separated. I think bioethics is a kind of technical discourse that comes out of particular political systems with their particular commitments to what the politics ought to look like, because after all, it promises. I mean, bioethics is every bit as promissory as gene editing is, right? It promises that there is a principled approach possible that will get you to the right results. But fine, the understanding of what the right results are will themselves be deeply culturally embedded. And the word culture has not appeared many times today. There was an anthropologist in the audience before who raised it, but I think that we do have to get down to that level. And so while I completely applaud your raising those two concepts side by side, I think that they're not unrelated to one another.
Oh, I have a question here in the back, and I was armed with a microphone here. So my question is about co-option of this idea of co-development. You mentioned that, and I was just wondering how we safeguard that. So it's like I see grant applications that come in and I'll review them, or papers, and there's a lot of like lip service towards the idea of co-development of hypotheses and co-development of questions. And this is how we help determine and come to consensus about questions that X community, whether it's indigenous or involved in the whole disability rights kind of aspect of things. So how do you know when something is genuinely co-developed versus when it's being co-opted for resources? And I know it's a difficult question, something I'm struggling with, and I'll just leave it at that. And I'm hoping that everyone can kind of jump on that because it concerns me greatly. Thank you.
Who want to respond to that?
I wouldn't say that I'm a co-development person.
I've said enough.
All right, it's good as a statement. Yeah, we'll have one more question. I'll let whoever has got the mic, let's figure out who had their hand up.
Hello.
Okay,
Hello.
Go ahead.
I know that there was a
bit of a response in that, I mean, so first of all, I think you're absolutely right to say that every time you see you ought to put your antenna of suspicion up, because whose is it? And, cooperate, collaborate. I mean, all of these words are profoundly suspect at one level, but that's why you need the vigilant civil society to express itself about the voices that are not at the table and so forth. But I think that if you were talking about not whatever the term was that you used, I mean, there's many things, but co-production, which was a word that I threw out, there is a sort of deeper philosophical level at which we go about producing emblems of society that are related to the things we desire for a society. And it's possible that there's some meta level, at some level at which even different interest groups within a society subscribe to a set of common propositions about what that society ought to look like American individualism. I mean, it's arguable that whichever political party you come from, that is a level at which you agree more than about how collective you should be. I mean, that's why that poll that we had before was interesting. So there are those kinds of levels at which I think one has to dig to, if one is really interested in a global approach to this, because I think that there are quite substantial divisions about which one considers to be important and significant and for what purpose.
Do we take one final question?
Yes, I know there was a certain movement to have Joe speak, but I don't know if he's here. But in any case, okay. Do we have? Should I make room for him? Or I have a question. Yeah, definitely. I'm into technology. It's slightly different. It's artificial intelligence, but I'm terribly conflicted about I love the work I'm doing, but I don't think it's going to be good for humanity. And because I feel like we have society's like a 3-year-old with a very sharp knife. And we're taking the knife away from him and giving him an Uzi. That's how I feel. So, technology can do almost anything. The one thing they can't do is stop. And a sort of a guiding principle I would suggest here is, like we were talking about, making the purchase of these ideas inclusive. And I would want to stress that. But my point of view is, as a human being, we maybe want to include business interests and our own technical purchase that we have here. You get it? Like, the basic place is, as a human being, do we want to be an artificial race? For instance, that's an example. Do we want to be an artificial race? That's coming from being a human being, and I would like to explore citizenship because and then maybe include our class of the developmental technology people, and then maybe include the business interests. Turn it on its head. When we speak, because we are that kind of middle class, historically middle class representative of the owner class, when we speak from that place. And so we say, I as a human being, we can't help it. We're technologists. I as a human being or philosopher, it's very hard to do, but I propose that we put ourselves really in the place of just a human being, not a human being invested in my career, my relationship to the people who pay me with the grants and the businesses. You get it.
All right, I'm going to let that stand.
Is Joe?
That's good. Let's stop.
We're going to have to move on. I'm sorry. So thank you to our panel.
Thank our panelists.
Yes. Thank you to our panel, everybody. And thank you for everyone asking questions. So I'm going to excuse the panelists. And then, so Bill is going to say a few words, and then I will, at the end, close this out. Joe's been speaking, and he's in the back. I'm sure he's happy to speak more with everybody. Yes? Okay. Thank you. Here's Bill.
So we're at the end of the day, clearly not the end of the dilemmas. In fact, I think we're at a better beginning for all of our collective discussion. I've been very impressed in the 30 years I've taught at Stanford how even a small seminar, there's a wisdom in the collective humanity that's greater than any one individual. And this is a very good start for it. So this is not only the end of today, this is the end of a planning phase of a series of 4 conferences that this project has involved. And before I go any further, I want to again thank the John Templeton Foundation. I think we all ought to clap for the foundation because they provided the vast majority of the funding for this. And it's really wonderful to have a foundation that has the vision to see the significance of something that's coming rather than has just already happened. So when Jennifer Doudna and I conceived this project, we recognized the importance of public engagement. In fact, that was the central theme. We realized we were at a crucial moment in science, that there's a dramatic, what's been called a threshold technology, that we're in a transition moment, a kind of a hinge in the history of science and humanity, that these were crucial moments, that they required great wisdom, and that the public was not just going to be the voice of deciding, but they were going to be those on whom the actions of this technology had the greatest impact. It's the whole human family that's going on here. These are really reasonably called species issues. And when you look at it that way, it's the individuals who bear the children, who raise the children, who teach the children, who do the maintenance work that keeps our civilization flowing, those who live in community, those who don't have necessarily high profits or high prestige in their work, those who struggle. Those voices needed to be heard in this, and that was our intention in setting up this project. We've had four planning meetings, and now we're going to design a fuller and broader project of outreach, education, and engagement. And I'm very excited about this because I think it really is significant, not just for those who do the quotidian tasks of daily existence in our everyday life, but for the species as a whole. We're at this crucial moment. Every class I've taught at Stanford, I have started my course by saying, we're on the outer edge of the expanding universe of ethics. We've never encountered these kind of questions before. It's our challenge to see this unfamiliar world and make sense of it. It's our challenge to form the concepts as well as the practical applications of this technology, the concepts that will shape our understanding and advance our cultures in a positive direction. And although our project has been called the Challenges and Opportunities of Genomic Editing, there's been a huge focus on the dilemmas and the worrisome things. Indeed, the whole problem is compounded by the fact that there's so much hyperbolic journalism, and there's a lot of fear, frustration, as well as a lot of disproportionate fantasies accompanying the public awareness of this. One of the great challenges Jennifer and I recognized from the beginning was that we needed to keep this dialogue in a balanced way moving forward so there was a positive opportunity for the good in this technology. I, as a physician, have a very strong sense of the way this can be used positively. In fact, it's about the most exciting moment in the history of medicine. What's coming is not just direct therapies on genetic engineering of human somatic or germline engineering, whatever it comes to, but there's a tool. This is really more than anything a revolution in the lab. That's going to open up vast increases in the understanding of developmental biology and the origins of both health and disease. More than anything, this is a tool that will advance all sorts of arenas of medicine, agriculture, environmental monitoring and interventions in a positive way. We need to keep the positive space open. This means it's a global challenge because it's not just our own local worlds or our societies, but it's a technology that's going to affect not just the gene pool, but our whole capacity to interact as a global public, which is an amazing thing. I mean, you think back on human history, there's been only one similar challenge, I think, of this magnitude, and that might be considered to have been nuclear energy. And yet that's such a narrow band of concern. Now this is so broad, it affects practically everything. It's clear a massive revolution is coming. It may be subtle, but it's going to be powerful. So it's a challenge to us at a global level. It's crucial that we use this opportunity as an opportunity that can be used to advance not just our discussions of this technology, but learning new tools of global dialogue and international cooperation. Likewise, it's on the other extreme end, it's a matter of the individual person. It's an opportunity for us to pause and think carefully about where we came from as individual humans, what constitutes a meaningful life, what the challenges are within the existing world of suffering and the great powers of good that can come through medicine. These all have to be framed within the understanding that is at the deepest level, one person at a time, collective social culture, and a sense of where we've come from as a species. Father Tam spoke eloquently about the significance of religion in this dialogue. I completely agree with him. At the deepest level, my sense is that religions do a lot of things, but one of the crucial things they do is they speak to us of our origins and our destinies, our purposes to be alive. They speak to the very core of the source and significance of our being. If we use this opportunity in this new public dialogue to pause and ponder the mystery of our origins and the enigma of our human future, individually and collectively, it can be a very exciting project. I think it's too often cast as a negative project. I think we need to turn it into a positive project, a way for us all to participate collectively in thinking through where we want to go and what we should do. Now, there's an old saying one of us talked about, human perfectibility. There's an old saying, as we now get into the nuts and bolts of our biological nature, there's an old saying we ought to keep in mind. The first principle of intelligent tinkering is to not throw away any of the parts. And I would say that involves more than just our material parts, but it includes our historical sense of values, our breadth of voices, and our depth of views. We need each other. We need to collectively go forward. It's a little bit like evolutionary process itself. It's a mysterious balance between stability and change. We need to take seriously our deep roots of traditional thought, our deep mythologies, our origin stories, and our sense of who we are in the fullest sense. So it's a great opportunity, but at the same time, it's a great obligation. And I would say that one thing I've seen here today and thought of throughout this project, as Jennifer and I have carried on these conferences and deep conversations, is that what I think is most evident is, and has been very prominent, I believe, in the dialogue, is the need for humility. I think we all know we're facing something that is of really, really great significance. I think that's why you're all here. And I see you as the harbingers of this dialogue. You understand that humility, above all, is needed. Humility in the sense that we need to be humble about what we know in terms of knowledge, but humility also with regard to one another and the respect for other views. Humility is a very important word, by the way, to the John Templeton Foundation. It's kind of the motto of the foundation, in the sense that it's only through the humble approach that we will actually find our way forward in the most positive sense. Humility is very appropriate here because, as we've discovered today, we may be talking about really, really complicated things that are just about as comprehensively complex as you can get, namely human genetics and the process of intervening in our biology. But the humility comes from recognizing that we can't even control the up and running function of our power grid. So how are we going to do it with these great, vast things? We need to recognize there are limits to human nature. Having said that, I want to point out that notwithstanding the challenge of it, Lee managed to make it happen. So finally, I want to thank Lee and Julie and all the other organizers whose work behind the scenes have been so important in making this happen and unfold so smoothly and I think beautifully. And I want to finally, and above all, thank all of you for coming, because you are the crucial component in public outreach. You are the voices, you are the thoughts, you are the wisdom collectively. So thank you, and I hope you will continue to engage these important issues and contribute. And I want to assure you we're going to take all of the things that were said here today, and we're meeting again tomorrow, the speakers, to talk them through. And your voices have been heard, and we thank you for that.